prophet Samuel speaking to King Saul. You've not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. Now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. Who was that man after God's own heart? David. And what made David a man after God's own heart? What made him the man that he became? And I hope that we'll find the answer to that question this morning. Now, I must confess, this is possibly the hardest sermon I've ever written. It's got a lot of unusual customs, very alien to our modern sensibilities, some very obscure laws. It gets quite complicated, but I hope and pray that with God's help that we will be able to plough our way successfully through it. Now, over the past few weeks, I've drawn attention to the 5 women who feature in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, right at the beginning of Matthew's gospel. That long list of names. It's 5 women who feature in that list. I've preached already about Tamar, the trickster, Rahab, the sex worker. Last time I preached about Ruth, the outsider, and I've covered the first half of her story. Before moving on to the second half, I'll give a very brief recap on what's happened so far. So chapter 1 opened with an Israelite family in Bethlehem. Bethlehem's one of the most famous cities in the world, where Jesus was born. So there's Elimelech, Naomi, and their sons Mahlon and Chilion. They're struggling to survive a famine. In search of food, they move to the neighboring land of Moab, where Mahlon and Chilion marry Moabite women. For unknown reasons, Elimelech and his 2 sons die. We don't know why. Grief-stricken with no reason to stay, Naomi tells her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, that she's going back to her home in Israel. She knows the life of a foreign widow will be unbearably hard for them. So she compels them to return to their families in Moab and remarry. However, Ruth insists on remaining with her mother-in-law. And the 2 of them return to Israel, back to Bethlehem together. And at the end of the chapter, Naomi blames God for her tragic fate, for everything that's happened to her. Chapter 2 began with Naomi and Ruth discussing where to find food. Well, we're here in Bethlehem now. Where are we going to find food? How are we going to survive? And Ruth offers to go out and glean barley from the harvest fields. And without realizing it, she begins this actually dangerous task in a field belonging to Naomi's relative Boaz. A dangerous task because of what could happen to Ruth while she's out there. And having noticed Ruth working in his field, in one of his fields, Boaz finds out who she is and then engages her in conversation. And this results in Boaz making special provision for Ruth, making allowances for her. And after Ruth comes home that day, Naomi is thrilled to find out that she met Boaz because he is a close family relative who could potentially provide for them. Bear in mind, these are 2 widows. Provide for them and protect Elimelech's assets, Elimelech being Naomi's dead husband. And by the end of the chapter, Naomi's faith in God is wonderfully restored. And for the first time, the devastating deaths of her husband and 2 sons, all the men in the family, the first time since then, she glimpses the light of hope and realizes that God hasn't abandoned her, but has been there all along, showing his hesed, that word, that Hebrew word, that is best translated as God's steadfast loving kindness, showing his love through Ruth. Through Ruth. And that's often how God shows his love. He shows it through other people, through their kindness. Now, rather than read the last 2 chapters of Ruth, we really don't have time to do that, I'll try and summarize them for you. Now, chapter 3 begins with Naomi making a plan that, if successful, will result in Ruth being married off to Boaz. Naomi instructs Ruth to wash, put on perfume, dress in her best clothes, put her glad rags on, if you like. And this would make it very clear that she is back on the market, if you like. She wants to remarry. And Naomi tells Ruth to go to the threshing floor at night. Find where, I'll tell you more about the threshing floor later. Find where Boaz is sleeping. Carefully uncover his feet. I told you about strange customs. Carefully uncover his feet and lie down next to them. And during the night, Boaz wakes up and is startled when he discovers a woman lying by his feet. And notice lying by his feet, not next to him, not in any inappropriate way, lying by his feet. And at this point, Ruth deviates from Naomi's instructions. Now, I'll talk a bit more about that later. She effectively asks Boaz to both redeem, buy back Naomi's family estate, and restore the legacy of her dead husband, Elimelech. And once again, Boaz is amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and calls her a woman of noble character. But he tells her that there's someone more closely related to Elimelech, to Naomi's dead husband, who should be given, who really must be given first refusal on whether or not to act as the family's guardian redeemer. And if they are unwilling to do so, Boaz vows to do it instead. And Ruth returns to Naomi, where they marvel together at the night's events, at what has transpired. And there's a sense of anticipation and excitement about what's going to happen the next day. And in chapter 4, inspired by Ruth's bold request, Boaz assembles the local leaders at the town gate. That was the place where all legal matters were discussed and settled. And there he outmaneuvers the closer family member, and he purchases the family property of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. But an integral part of that arrangement involves marrying Ruth. And I'll hopefully explain why that was an integral part of the arrangement. And the story concludes with the restoration of Naomi's family. The restoration of Elimelech's, a dead man's, legacy. His line continues. Ruth conceives and gives birth to a boy called Obed, who becomes the heir to Elimelech's estate and ensures the continuation of his family line. And at the end of the second chapter, you may remember that Ruth, speaking of God, at the end of the second chapter of Ruth, And you may remember that speaking of God, Naomi says, he has not stopped showing his kindness. He has not stopped showing his hesed, his steadfast loving kindness to the living and the dead. And we'll actually see how God's hesed, God's love, reaches beyond the grave, even blessing the dead, even blessing Elimelech. And that statement that Naomi makes, it marks a dramatic turning point for her. And as I said earlier, and last time, it's the moment when her faith in God is restored. And she realizes that God's love has not deserted her. God's love has always been with her, even in the midst of tragedy. And that ties in with what you were praying earlier, Frank. And she's able to praise God even in the midst of the storms of life. And through Ruth's self-sacrifice, Naomi rediscovers God's hesed, his perfect love. This then inspires her to love. This then inspires Naomi to love. And she inclines her heart towards Ruth. She starts looking outward again. And she inclines her heart towards Ruth and to her needs. The Apostle John wrote, "We love because he first loved us." We love because he first loved us. And Naomi loves because God has first loved her. And all Naomi wants at this point is to see her daughter-in-law safe and secure under the protective umbrella of a good man like Boaz. Now, some of the things I'm going to be saying this morning might jar with you because, as I said, they go against our modern sensibilities. They may seem very sexist, but we're talking about ancient Israel. We're talking about a different world with very different customs. Naomi's hope is that family relations, the fact that he's her close relative, will incline Boaz to see past Ruth's low marriage prospects. Well, she is she is a Moabitess, yeah, and the Moabites were the enemies of Israel. But not only that, well, she's an immigrant. And if you like, an enemy immigrant. But she has no social connections. She has no wealth. There's no family behind her. Not only that, but there's uncertainty about whether or not she can have children. She never had any children while she was married to her first husband, Naomi's son, Mahlon. Now, that's not just to mean that she couldn't, but there's a question mark there. Well, why has she not had any children? She's been married before. Now, with no male go-between to negotiate a marriage, Naomi devises a scheme that is fraught with risk. It's fraught with risk. I'm not going to quite call it Mission Impossible, but it's close. She sends Ruth out alone in the night to the threshing floor celebration. Bathed, perfumed, wearing her best clothes to signal her readiness for marriage. And the threshing floor was where harvesters separated valuable grain, the heavier kernels of grain, from the husks, the chaff. And that got blown away. And once harvest was over, the threshing floor became the site of a great celebration. We collected all this food, all this grain. Let's celebrate. Let's enjoy ourselves. But threshing floor celebrations had a reputation for, you probably imagine drunkenness. excess, immorality. And for this reason, Naomi instructs Ruth to remain hidden. Remain hidden. So she goes in there like a ninja, if you like. Remain hidden until Boaz has finished eating and drinking. And once Boaz has retired for the night and fallen asleep, Ruth is to quietly, stealthily go to where he is, make sure no one else is awake, uncover his feet, lie down next to them, and wait. Wait for him to tell her what to do next. Wait to be led by the man. Now, the unusual, very unusual actions Naomi instructs Ruth to take, they're intended to be a marriage proposal. That's the intention behind it. It's a way of saying, will you marry me? And the benefit of doing it in this way, quietly under cover of darkness, allowed Boaz to refuse Ruth without publicly humiliating her or damaging her already very low marriage prospects. And Ruth scrupulously follows Naomi's instructions to the letter. She watches, waits in the darkness. When all is quiet, except for the occasional snore, she makes her way, as I said, stealthily, a bit like a ninja, to where Boaz is sleeping. And as Naomi instructed, Ruth gently uncovers his feet and lies down next to them. Sleeping contentedly, probably against some grain, under the stars, Boaz suddenly feels the cool night air on his feet. You might wonder, why does she uncover his feet? Boaz suddenly feels the cool night air on his feet. Because threshing floors were high up on a hill, there were flat areas, they could get quite windy. He awakens and is startled to look down at his feet and find a woman lying there. Who are you? He asks. I am your servant, Ruth, she says. I am your servant, Ruth. Now, so far, everything has gone according to Naomi's plan. All Ruth needs to do now, she's got to where she needs to be. No one has seen her. All she needs to do now is wait for Boaz's response. He'll either accept her marriage proposal or he'll gently refuse her. And she can disappear back off to Naomi. But instead of waiting for Boaz to respond, as Naomi instructed, Ruth risks everything. She risks everything. And at the last moment, she tosses Naomi's script aside, she throws it away, and follows her own. And instead of waiting for Boaz to tell her what to do, she tells him. She tells him. She's risking everything at this point. Spread the collar of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family, she tells him. Spread the collar of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. Now, Naomi sent Ruth to that threshing floor in the hope that Boaz would rescue her, and this was the ancient world that they were living in, would rescue her from a life of childless poverty. But in a surprising twist, Ruth jeopardizes her own future happiness by raising the stakes. Raising the stakes not to benefit herself, but to benefit Naomi. She's there with a different purpose. She's there to rescue the legacy of Naomi's dead husband, Elimelech. When Ruth tells Boaz to spread the corner of his garment over her, she clearly states the reason why he should do this. He should do it because he is a guardian redeemer of Naomi's family. Now, not only was Ruth using legal terminology, she was deliberately conflating or combining two different Mosaic laws into one. Highly irregular. And both these laws, they concerned rescuing men. She's there to be rescued by a man. But these laws that she's talking about, they were intended to rescue men from shame and dishonor. Now, the kinsman redeemer law required a man's nearest male relative to purchase his land if he was forced to sell it. And it allowed for a man to buy his land back. It prevented its permanent loss from the family. The levirate law, a different law altogether, similar in that it was there to rescue men from shame and dishonor. This levirate law came into play if a man died without a male heir. And it required his brother by birth, that's important, his brother by birth, to marry his widow. And the firstborn son from that marriage became the deceased man's legal son, his legal heir, and continued the dead man's line on the family tree. And that firstborn son also inherited the dead man's estate. It was there to rescue men from the shame and dishonor of basically having their line, their genealogy wiped out, cut off. So what Ruth does is she combines the kinsman redeemer law and the levirate law, and she asks Boaz to obey them both. She asks Boaz to obey them both. But here's the problem. Neither of these laws actually apply to him. Neither of them apply to him. Boaz is neither Elimelech's nearest male relative. He's not the nearest male relative. He's a close one, but not the nearest. Nor is he Elimelech's brother by birth. There's absolutely no obligation whatsoever for him to obey either law. Ruth knew this. Of course, she knew this. She wasn't stupid. She was a smart woman. She knew this. Boaz was beyond the reach of the letter of the law, but not its spirit. Ruth's proposal looked beyond outward compliance to the letter of the law to its spirit. What was the purpose of these laws? Why were they there? What were they intended to do? And generations later, Ruth's descendant Jesus would interpret the law in much the same way. And he did that during his Sermon on the Mount. Eventually, we'll get there as we continue on through Matthew. Ruth was hoping that Boaz's response to her irregular, unusual request, that his response would be rooted in compassion and a desire to do God's will. To do God's will. Ruth wasn't looking for a husband to protect and provide for her. She was volunteering herself to essentially be a surrogate mother, to bear a son who would restore and continue the line of Naomi's dead husband, Elimelech. And this is why Boaz is completely awestruck by Ruth's hesed, and he uses the word hesed, her profound love for Naomi. Her willingness to, and it's not the first time she's done this, her willingness to sacrifice her own interests for someone else's. He recognizes Ruth for who she is. He recognizes her great value. She is a woman of great substance, a woman of noble character. More than a match for him, surpassing him. And the next day, inspired by Ruth's courage, Boaz sets out to fulfill her proposal and help her rescue Naomi's family from shame and dishonor. However, as I referred to in the brief summary, there's one significant obstacle Boaz needs to overcome. There's another guardian redeemer, more closely related to Naomi, who has first refusal on whether or not to redeem the family. And Boaz presents Naomi's case at the gate to Bethlehem, where the town elders gathered. And ignoring the letter of the law, but following its spirit, if you like, Boaz insists that Naomi has property rights. She has no property rights whatsoever. But he insists that she has property rights. And that purchasing her land, the land legally didn't belong to her, but purchasing her land was an urgent matter. Then, taking his lead from Ruth, he suggests that if the nearer guardian redeemer wishes to buy Naomi's land, he must also fulfill levirate law. Levirate law. And what first seemed to be a lucrative investment for Naomi's closer relative, we don't know who he was or what his name was, what first seemed like this is a bit of a winner, this one. I can increase my assets, no downsides. At first it seems very lucrative. Suddenly, when Boaz starts talking about levirate law, it becomes a high-stakes gamble that he's not willing to take. And he ends up telling Boaz to act as guardian redeemer in his place. Well, you marry the Moabitess. I'm not prepared to do it. And Boaz manages to push through everything. It's like a town council meeting. You might have a local town council meeting, trying to push through, I don't know, planning permission or something like that. Boaz manages to push through everything Ruth proposed and have it ratified by the town elders. Inspired by Ruth, he presented a radical reinterpretation of the law. And he got away with it. No one opposed him. No one opposed him. Why was this? Why was this? Well, the answer is found in the very short genealogy at the end of the story, at the end of chapter 4. This reveals a little bit more about who Boaz is. He belonged to a very prominent family in the leading tribe of Judah. His grandfather, Nahshon, was the commanding general of the tribe of Judah, the third man in rank after Moses and Aaron. Moses, Aaron, Nahshon. That was his grandfather. Boaz was a highly respected man with considerable power and influence. But rather than abuse his power and influence for personal gain, he used it to advance the cause of two destitute widows. And at the seat of Bethlehem's government, Boaz gives Naomi and Ruth a legal voice, which they didn't have before. He powerfully intercedes on their behalf. And generations later, Boaz's descendant, Jesus, is interceding on our behalf. At the very highest seat of government, the right hand of God. Boaz marries Ruth, and they have a son called Obed. And the story concludes with the widow who lost her husband and both sons cradling baby Obed in her arms as if he were her own. And Naomi's neighbors rejoice with her, and they say, now at last Naomi has a son again. Naomi has a son again. The birth of Obed marks a new beginning for Naomi. She will help raise the man who will become the grandfather of King David. From Naomi, Obed will learn about God's hesed, about God's steadfast loving kindness. He'll learn that God's love never ends. It never ends. And Obed will pass on what he learns from Naomi to his son, Jesse, who will eventually pass it on to David, who will express it through the Psalms that he writes, with lines such as, surely your goodness and hesed and love will follow me all the days of my life. That's a line that could have been written by Naomi. The birth of Obed marks a new beginning for Boaz. He will impart his wisdom to the man who will become the grandfather of King David. And from Boaz, Obed will learn how to wield power with restraint. How to wield power with restraint. How to use it responsibly for the benefit of others. And Obed will pass on what he learns from Boaz to his son, Jesse, who will eventually pass it on to David. Who will eventually pass it on to David, who will twice stay his hand and refuse to cut the throat of his murderous father-in-law, Saul. Who will resist the temptation to drink fresh, cool water taken from a well in Bethlehem, but will instead exercise self-control and pour it on the ground out of respect for the men who risked their lives to get it. And we see Boaz's ability to wield power with restraint. We see it in David. And the birth of Obed marks a new beginning for Ruth. And as Obed grows up and watches his birth mother, he will see faith in action. He will see how faith inspires courage and boldness. And Obed's grandson, David, will exercise that same faith when he enters the valley of Elah to confront the giant Philistine Goliath. Both Naomi and his birth parents helped to shape Obed into the man that he becomes. And their godly influence continues down the generations and helps to shape David into the man he becomes, a man after God's own heart, a man whose desires and motivations are aligned with God's desires and motivations, a man after God's own heart, who will become king in Israel and will establish a royal line that will culminate with Jesus, the Messiah. Amen.